Am I right, Miami? Yo, shout out to Yuri Prohaska for having zero fight IQ. Kelvin Gastelum, he ruined my life last night. Honestly, after Gastelum lost, I just turned off the TV and I just left. I went on a walk and I stopped watching. And as I was about to cry and give up, I told myself, no, I'm not going to quit. So I put a ton of money down, chased my losses from Kelvin Gastelum on Josh Hockett. And in one of the craziest fights I've ever seen, Hockett came through in a big way for me. So, am I right, Miami? And yeah, Yuri Prohaska having no fight IQ, that helped me out a lot because it cashed my Ulbrich ticket as well. I thought it was done. So after what looked like was going to be one of the worst nights ever, it ended up being a pretty decent night for me. Hockett came through, Ulbrich came through. Kelvin Gastelum had that fight. He was looking so good, but then gets submitted by one of the best submission artists in the game. So I also thought Johnny Walker won his fight as well. Azamat Mirzakhanov, he got dominated. We saw vintage Polo Costa. And actually, a lot of you guys in my comments were telling me Costa is going to win by TKO. Like, there's some sharp guys in my comments, so congrats to you guys getting that call right. But yeah, I don't know. Weird night. Am I right, Miami? So, yo, guys, real talk though. This Canada card, it's just not it. I'm not a fan of it. I barely know anyone on the card. Bunch of new guys making their debut, and my passion was lacking this week. So don't be surprised if I get every fight wrong this week. But yeah, let's jump in. First fight of the night, we got Yannis versus Siraj. I'm gonna pick Siraj to win this fight. This seems like a low-level matchup. Yannis, he's the guy who stepped in on short notice to fight Austin Bashi last year. Bashi was just pretty much able to ragdoll him and submit him. Yannis was, he was decent on the regional scene, nothing special. And Siraj is someone who is Canadian, making his debut, had a decent run on the regional scene. He was on a 9-fight win streak at one point, but he's fighting absolute cans, just the same as Yannis was, right? Yannis, he's more of a brawler, heavy stand-up approach. He likes to dog it out on the feet. He thrives in pocket exchanges, while Siraj is more technical and well-rounded, able to mix in his overall game with wrestling and striking. I think Yannis is going to want to come in, close the distance, force a dirty dog fight, fight in the pocket, but I don't think Jamey is going to get bullied or ran over in that approach, I can see Jamey staying calm, utilizing his grappling, and using grappling on Yannis. It's kind of Yannis's weakness, right? So I think it's a clear path for victory here for Jamey, and Jamey should be the more complete and technical fighter, because Yannis, he is more of a brawler. He's kind of sloppy, and he's just got ragdolled in his debut, whereas Siraj, he's more technical, well-rounded. I think he has the better grappling, so I think it's a clear and easy path for Siraj to win using the grappling, but we'll see how that plays out. Moving on to our next fight, we got Mark Vologdin versus John Castaneda. I'm going to go with Mark Vologdin to win this fight. John Castaneda, he might be the more experienced, polished fighter with better skills, but you can't teach heart. And sometimes you have to lean into heart, and you just can't teach heart. If you don't know who Mark Vologdin is, he was part of one of, if not the craziest fight on Contender Series history. He went to war with his opponent on the Contender Series. Both guys had huge moments in that fight, and it was such a dogfight that both fighters ended up being signed to the UFC, and they were both given 25K bonuses that night. Mark Vologdin, he had his moments in that fight for sure. He dropped his opponent multiple times in the first round with some clean, effective boxing combinations, and in the second round, Mark Vologdin, he got cut by an elbow, which opened up a gash above his eye, but he still kept marching forward like a Terminator. And the third round was competitive. Both guys, they had their moments, but his opponent mixed in a takedown, which ultimately led to the opponent getting a victory by 29-28 on the scorecards. So we don't have to question the heart and pure savageness of this guy, Mark Vologdin. He will do whatever it takes to win a fight. He will fight through any amount of adversity, and that's huge. He has the skills and he has the hunger. And despite the war he had and the fact that he throws really hard, he still manages distance and will try to fight smart, but he isn't afraid to close the distance if he has to, right? And I feel like that makes me want to back him here in this fight versus John Castaneda. Castaneda, he's 4-4 in the UFC. The guys he beat are Eddie Wineland, Miles Johns, Muin Gafarov, guys like that, but when he's losing to Nathaniel Wood, Daniel Marcos, Daniel Santos. So he's able to beat the below average guys of the UFC, but the average, slightly above average level, he tends to struggle, right? And I do think Mark Vologdin has what it takes to be at least average, slightly above average fighter in the UFC. And I think this fight with Castaneda, it has potential to be fireworks. Castaneda has a boxing heavy approach, and he's durable enough to be in a dogfight. Although we've seen Castaneda get knocked out by Daniel Santos, and obviously Mark Vologdin, he's an explosive striker with unpredictable attacks. He'll come at you with spinning back kicks, spinning back fists. So I think early on, Mark is going to come in like an absolute truck. But like I said, despite how hard Mark hits, he still manages distance. He isn't just a brawler. He keeps this wide karate stance where he likes to pick his shots. Like sometimes he looks like a tiny Conor McGregor, but he isn't afraid to throw down in the pocket as well. So I think that athleticism, that hunger, that accuracy and the pace and the pressure, it should mostly be coming from Mark. I see Mark being the cleaner striker, but also being able to throw down in the pocket if he has to, while Castaneda won't be as clean and will be limited to only like a brawling type of style, if you will. So I'm going to say that Mark has the cleaner shots being landed, Castaneda trying to force the brawl, but Mark keeping it clean and also being able to fight in the pocket as well if he has to, because one thing I know for sure, Vologdin, he's a dog, he's got power and he thrives in chaos, but he's still composed, whereas Castaneda, he's kind of proven himself to just be like a mid-tier type of fighter, and he struggles with decent fighters, and I do think Vologdin is a decent fighter, so I think Vologdin is going to be able to use his pressure and hunger and just have the bigger moments of this fight, but it should be a dog fight. Moving on to Mitch Raposo versus Allan Nascimento. This was actually a tough fight to pick. I'm going to pick Mitch Raposo. I think he's going to use his takedown defense and land the better shots. But I want to give the matchmakers a round of applause for this matchup because this is actually a sick fight. And I think it's going to be a good fight. Mitch Raposo, he started his UFC career with 2 split decision losses to Andre Lima and Sumadarji. And I considered both those guys high-level fighters. But after those 2 split decision losses, a lot of people wrote him off. And in his next fight, as a massive underdog, he goes in there, beats Azat Maxim. Now looking back, Azat Maxim was never really that good, but still impressive for Mitch Raposo to beat him and show he's actually a lot better than what his UFC record suggests. Right, going 0-2 first in the UFC. Raposo, he showed great takedown defense in that fight and put up some heavy pressure with his boxing combinations against Azat Maxim, who was not only the taller fighter by 3 inches, but a fighter who missed weight by 3 pounds as well in that fight. So in this fight here versus Allan Nascimento, Raposo will be 4 inches shorter than Nascimento, which is already a disadvantage. For Raposo, because to land his boxing combinations, he's going to have to need to close the distance on someone who's harder to reach because he's longer, right? But I can see Raposo landing those shots because Nascimento, he's hittable. Nascimento was getting cracked in his last fight versus Cody Durden in the first 2 rounds. And if Cody Durden is cracking you with those shots, that's not a great sign. It wasn't until Nascimento landed a sneaky elbow that stunned Durden, which shifted the fight into Nascimento's favor, being able to lock in an anaconda choke as Durden went in for a takedown, right? And I feel like I have to favor Mitch Raposo because he showed to be such a dog in his last fight. He kept the fight on the feet using great takedown defense and was still able to land hard boxing combinations on the feet. Sorry. And we just saw Nascimento get touched up in the striking by Cody Durden in his last fight. So, and if you watch the post-fight interview for Raposo after his win in his last fight, he was yelling to the crowd saying, plus 300 underdog my ass, yelling it, right? So clearly he felt like he was being super disrespected by the community and the odds makers as well. So I feel like this kid is hungry to prove the doubters wrong, and it's a perfect opponent for him to fight, someone who's on a 4-fight win streak, been looking good. And I'm going to have faith in Raposo. I'm going to have faith in his hunger. He'll be able to get a win here by stuffing the takedowns and keeping the fight on the feet, landing the heavier shots. And despite being the smaller guy, we saw him do it to Azat Maxim, and obviously Azat isn't Nascimento, but I'm going to have faith that he can replicate that same game plan in a matchup that presents similar stylistic obstacles. Raposo has been submitted before by Jack Hadley back in 2021, which was 5 years ago. So that kind of worries me. But still, watching Cody Durden land shots on Nascimento and walk him down like that, that worries me for Nascimento even more, right? So I think Raposo will use the takedown defense and land the better shots. And Raposo's just a dog, he's got strong takedown defense. And with that mixed in with that boxing pressure, you know, I don't know if that slick grappling of Nascimento is going to be enough because he is hittable on the feet. So I'm going to say that Raposo will be able to stuff those takedowns and win the fight on the feet. Moving on to Jamey-Lyn Horth versus JJ Aldrich. I'm going to go with Jamey-Lyn Horth. I think we've seen enough of both fighters to get a feel of who they are. And I feel like JJ Aldrich has kind of, hit her ceilings in terms of reaching her potential. She's good enough to stay in the UFC and beat these average level fighters. But when it comes to that next level of competition in the UFC, like these higher than average level fighters, she tends to struggle, especially recently. Her most recent losses are to Erin Blanchfield, Ariane Delipsky, and Veronica Hardy. And these are some like decent and recognizable names, whereas her wins recently haven't been to anyone impressive or worth talking about. And I say recently because 4 years ago in 2022, she got a win over Jillian Robertson, which aged really nicely, but we haven't seen that version of her lately. And now, on the other hand, Jamey-Lyn Horth, she's been looking like an absolute killer lately. She picked apart Vanessa Demopoulos on the feet. Vanessa, she did take that fight on short notice, but still, Jamey-Lyn Horth was able to use her size and just jab and 1-2s down the middle the whole fight. Then Jamie's next fight, in her most recent fight, she goes on and knocks out Teresa Bleda in the first round, and Jamie didn't have her size advantage in that fight like she usually does. She was actually the shorter fighter by 2 inches and still knocks out Teresa Bleda in the first round when Jamie was a massive underdog as well. So I've been impressed with what Jamie's been doing. She will have her usual size advantage here as well. I haven't been too impressed with JJ Aldrich. And I think despite Jamie's age of 36, she still looks super athletic. She's got heavy body kicks, sharp right hands, and I think she'll be able to manage distance on Aldrich. Aldrich is going to try to do the same thing back to her, but I just think like fight in the same similar style, but I just think Jamie should be a step ahead in picking her apart from the outside and keeping this fight on the feet if Aldrich does try to go for takedowns. I don't know. I just feel like JJ Aldrich has kind of plateaued. She's beating low-level fighters, whereas Horth is a big fighter. She's improving, coming off of a strong performance. So I'm going to say that Horth has obviously the size advantage, and she's going to be the sharper striker in this matchup, landing the better shots. Moving on to Melissa Croden versus Darya Zheleznyakova. I was kind of surprised by the odds here. I just feel like it should be a lot closer. I'm going to pick Darya Zheleznyakova to win this fight, because I feel like in a mostly stand-up battle, I'm going to favor the more technical striker in Darya, while Croden, I can see her getting picked apart from the outside, not allowing Croden to close the distance and get her in the clinch or get Croden's clinch game going, Croden has success over a lot of women because of her size, being able to easily close the distance, being the bigger fighter, work knees in the clinch, but that won't be the case here. I was hyped about Melissa Croden signing to the UFC, and the reason why I was hyped about Melissa Croden coming to the UFC was because she's so big compared to the other fighters and dominant in the clinch, using knees up the middle, being able to out-physical her opponents, being the bigger, taller fighter, getting them in the clinch and kneeing them up the middle. But in this matchup, she won't have that advantage because she's fighting a fellow tall fighter, and also in Melissa Croden's last match, she got out-grappled by a much smaller fighter. However, that fighter was Luana Santos, and Luana Santos is very good, right? But still, I thought Melissa Croden would be able to use her size and implement her will on Luana. However, that wasn't the case, and I feel like because she doesn't even have the chance to use her size advantage in this matchup versus Darya, I have to lean with Darya, who actually looks quite impressive, especially in her last matchup. Darya has only ever lost to Eileen Perez, who's an absolute monster, and Melissa Mullins. And Darya just avenged her loss to Melissa Mullins in her last fight. So technically, Darya's only true defeat now is Eileen Perez because she just tied the series with Melissa Mullins. And losing to Eileen Perez is nothing to be ashamed of. Perez is demolishing everyone in the division. And to be fair, Melissa Croden lost to a great fighter as well, Luana Santos, and she also has a loss to Jacqueline Calvacanti, which is another good fighter, right? But to see Melissa Croden get out grappled like that in her last matchup, it kind of makes me lean to believe that Darya might be a level above, because Darya was able to avenge her loss, in her last matchup versus a decent fighter in Melissa Mullins. And Croden didn't look as good as I thought she would in her last fight. This fight, I feel like it should be mostly a stand-up battle. I think Darya is the more technical striker. She has great boxing with heavy hands and a nice composed jab, good footwork on the outside. On the other hand, Melissa, she has a 100% finish rate, so she's coming to scrap. But I think her best path here would be to throw some knees and elbows in the clinch. But I don't see her having much success trying to bully a fighter who's the same size as her. So I think Darya is gonna stay on the outside, use her superior boxing fundamentals, use her jab and create angles, which can frustrate Croden because that won't allow Croden to close the distance and work in her clinch game. Because I feel like that's truly what Croden's best path here. That's how she gets her game going. She's a clinch bully. She kind of relies on her size, whereas Darya, she's more of a technical striker and she's more composed. So I think Darya might be able to just keep this fight at range and pick her apart from the outside. So moving on to Tanner Boser versus Gakhan Sarikam. This was a tough one. I'm gonna pick Tanner Boser to win this fight. In what seems to be a stand-up fight, Tanner looks to be like the more technical guy, while Gokhan is the more sloppier brawler type of fighter who's gonna push forward. I favor the movement ability and technicality and cardio of Tanner over Gokhan, Gokhan's probably going to get picked apart in the striking and slows down after not being able to land a big shot in the first round. Tanner, he was released by the UFC in 2023. Then he fights one time in the regional scene, gets a win. Now he's back. I imagine it's because he's Canadian and they need Canadians on the Canada card. And Tanner wasn't ever really a great fighter, obviously, because he got released. He went 5-5 in the UFC on his first run. He never really beat anyone good. He was able to get a knockout win over Ovince St. Preux, but OSP was like 38 at the time. But yeah, he was never really UFC level. But he at least has some UFC wins. Like, he has wins in the UFC and he has the UFC experience, and he won't be pressured by the moment making his debut or whatever, because he's been there and done that like 10 times already, right? So on the other hand, we have Gokhan Sarikam, and this guy truly doesn't have any notable wins. He's a Bellator guy, but like the guys he's beating are no different than retired cab drivers, right? And I feel like he's 35 years old, making his debut, and that's never really a good sign. Having no notable wins and you're past your prime. Whereas I can at least say Tanner has some UFC experience and UFC wins, which is it's more of a trustworthy pick for me, And we'll talk about that later, because it's like the same thing that in the Mandel Herbert fight. That's a weird fight as well, but it's just a matchup of two big fat heavyweights here, and I feel like they should be striking both. They should both be striking for the most part. Gokhan, he's more of a heavy-handed striker. He likes to pressure. Tanner is more of a technical fighter, relies on volume and movement. And I think Tanner should be the smarter fighter here, making the better decisions, being able to move nicely for someone of his size, not letting Gokhan close the distance so easily. He'll stay on the outside, pick Gokhan apart, while Gokhan gets frustrated from not being able to close the distance and not being able to land his power shots. Tanner can also still look good as the fight goes on, whereas Gokhan can tend to slow down if he doesn't get you out of there early, right? And Gokhan is gonna weigh much more. He's a lot fatter in weight. Like he weighs in around like 245 or something, and Tanner's like a guy who's fought at light heavyweight. So I think the speed, agility, and movement and technicality of Tanner should be enough for him to win this fight. Using his technical striking, his movement, probably has the better cardio. Whereas what's his name? Sarikam. Yeah, he's heavy, slow. He's like a power brawler. So I'm gonna say Boser just outworks him and outclasses him. Moving on to our next fight, we got Robert Valentine versus Julien LeBlanc. I'm pretty sure Robert Valentine was underdog. I'm gonna pick Robert Valentine. I just think Robert is due for a win here. You know, obviously he's 0-3 in the UFC, but the matchups he's been getting have been so stylistically bad for him. His first two UFC fights were against high-level wrestlers who kept going for takedowns. Taurus Finney went for takedown after takedown, one of the most boring fights in the UFC. And before that, Ryan Loder, he went for takedowns, and Robert actually showed some good scrambling ability there until he got put in a crucifix position and couldn't escape the elbows. You know, then finally in his most recent fight, he gets a matchup against a striker. And you think he can actually show his dangerous wrestling and his dangerous striking abilities now in that fight, but the striker they give him is a Teba Gutierrez, one of, if not the scariest prospects in the UFC right now. So clearly it's been a rough first three fights in the UFC for Robert, but it really is just unlucky matchmaking, getting two high-level wrestlers right off the bat, then the greatest striking prospect in the UFC right now. I think we'll finally be able to see Robert's abilities showcased in this matchup against Julian LeBlanc, who's making his debut. You know, Julian is primarily a striker with effective wrestling skills as well, but Robert is the same, you know, effective wrestling skills, and he can strike as well. I just think Robert might be the more dangerous fighter. You know, he's aggressive and likes to push forward. He won't back away from a war. You know, when he's on, he's looking violent and dangerous. And I see a fight of Julian. I've seen a fight of Julian on the regional scene versus someone named Darian Weeks, where Julian was kind of getting out physicaled in the clinch, you know, controlled up against the fence. So I feel like Robert can close the distance and do that here, you know, and be the more physically dominant guy in the clinch, because it does say they're both the same height, but I feel like Robert is going to be bigger and bulkier, more physically demanding in there. Plus, Robert is due for a win. I think stylistically, this matchup presents a similar style to his style. And so I think him being the more violent, a more physical guy in there will help him edge out these rounds. You know, because we can't just look at 0-3 and think he's a bad fighter. It's just really unlucky matchmaking for him. And I just think he has the physicality and aggression needed to win this fight versus someone who's decent but still unproven. So I'm going to pick Valentine to be more physically demanding in there and just has like the pressure edge in that fight. So moving on to Dennis Buzukja versus Marcin Barbosa. I'm going to pick Marcio Barbosa to win here. I feel like it would be silly to pick Dennis Buzukja here. He's 1-3 in the UFC, and his only win is to Connor Matthews, and Connor Matthews is 0-3 in the UFC. So clearly Dennis isn't a top caliber fighter, you know, and we take a look at Marcio Barbosa. Sure, he's making his debut, but there's definitely potential there. We can confirm that Dennis isn't a high caliber fighter, but we are yet to find out if Marcio can compete with these UFC guys. And based on the way he fights, I do think he can at least beat someone at the level of Dennis Buzukja. You know, Marcio is 7-1 in his last 8 fights, and the one loss he had is to Gabriel Santos, who's an outstanding UFC fighter. You know, and I've liked what I've seen from Marcio. You know, he keeps a high guard, likes to walk down his opponents, puts a ton of pressure on you with his movement, powerful hooks, and like I said, keeps a high guard. Like, he's definitely defensively sound. You know, he moves out of the way when guys try to throw on him. You know, he doesn't like to engage in brawls. He moves out the way, then goes right back to being in your face. You know, he throws nasty teep kicks up the middle, and when he throws his hands, it's like some hard, accurate shots coming back as well. So I think he's very calculated in his approach. You know, he's smart. He's a technical fighter. Finds a way to break down his opponents, and he hunts for the kill when he smells blood. Now, coming up against Dennis Buzukja, I think Dennis is way too hittable, and that's not good fighting someone like Marcio. You know, I feel like Dennis is gonna have to weather a storm early on in this fight, and if he does, then maybe he has a chance here, because Marcio tends to slow down towards the end of the rounds. Maybe Dennis can start picking him apart if he survives the first 2 rounds, or if he survives the first round. But I just think the way Marcio moves and how vulnerable Dennis's striking defense leaves him, I think Marcio should land a big shot in the first round, enough to either end the fight or compromise Dennis for the rest of the fight. Because Dennis Buzukja, he is very hittable, and I just feel like he has a low ceiling compared to someone like Barbosa, you know, who's a technical pressure striker. So I'm gonna say that Barbosa does land something big early on, enough to put him out or compromise him for the rest of the fight. Moving on to Thiago Moises versus Gage Young. You know, I'll pick Gage Young I think Gage Young is the better striker here. I feel like Moises is going to want to get this fight on the ground, but Gage Young has good enough wrestling to keep it on the feet and win the striking battle. Thiago Moises, he's been in the UFC for a while. He's been in the UFC for about 8 years, and I think it's safe to consider him as a journeyman. He's not one of these guys that'll ever be top five or fighting for the belt or whatever. He can win some, he'll lose some. And he's losing to some decent guys. His recent losses are to Jared Gordon, Ludovic Klein, and Benoit Saint Denis. Those are the most recent losses, and they're not the worst losses, but he's losing. And when it comes to these higher level guys, it proves that he's not a high caliber fighter. He actually has a win actually over Malquizal Costa back in 2023, which has aged really nicely. But that was Malquizal's Costa's debut, and that was before Malquizal started locking in, before he went on that crazy run. So, and just as of recent, I'm not a fan of how Thiago Moises looked in his last fight versus Jared Gordon. He got taken down as soon as the fight started, controlled on the ground and pounded. Then he did get back up, and then gets knocked out with a single clean punch from Jared. It makes me wonder about his durability. That punch landed right on the button, but he was completely out from that single strike. Gage Young, he's never been knocked out. I feel like being 25 years old right now, he has the durability to eat a shot if he has to. He's coming off of a nice win over Mahashate. And before that, what are his losses? Evan Elder and Killian Salkield. Gage Young went to a decision with Killian Salkield, and we know just how good Killian is, and also losing to Evan Elder, that's not even a bad loss. Elder has been looking good, currently on the 3-fight win streak. So I like the trajectory of Gage Young, where he's at right now. He's young, durable, never been knocked out, only losing to decent opposition, whereas Thiago Moises, he just got dominated in his last fight. I feel like he has durability concerns, and it's safe to assume he's just a journeyman at this point, and I like the potential of Gage Young. I don't expect him to dominate this matchup. This can be a close fight, but I think Gage Young is more technical and composed. I think Gage Young holds the more power. He's an explosive power puncher, and he has good wrestling. Whereas I feel like Thiago Moises is just primarily a grappler and would get outclassed on the feet here, for the most part. So I think Gage Young has good enough wrestling to keep this fight on the feet, dictate where the fight takes place, and win the striking exchanges, because Moises, he is primarily a grappler, but I don't, that durability concern of mine, I don't know about it. And Gage Young, he's younger, explosive striker, and he's improving. So I think Gage Young will be able to keep it on the feet and win the striking battle, just landing the better shots. Moving on to Jasmin Jasudavicius versus Karine Silva. I'm picking Jasmin Jasudavicius. I'm not going to lie. I've only ever cried one time while watching a UFC fight. Like, sometimes I'll cry watching back a fight like months after it happened, like an emotional Charles Oliveira edit, climbing the ranks after being called a quitter early in his career, then watching him win the belt, or a crazy Israel Adesanya edit, or, Volk getting knocked out or something like that. But I'll get emotional, but like months after it's happened. The only time I cried during an actual fight was Jasmin's last fight. Seeing her get knocked out by Manon Fiorot, that hit me so hard. I felt like so sad watching that. I'm clearly a huge fan of Jasmin. She has such a cute, fun, adorable personality, such a great person, such a sweet person, and it honestly just broke my heart. I had to step away from everyone while a tear just shed down my face. I couldn't watch it, And something deep down inside me knew that that was a terrible matchup for her. Jasmin's striking defense is not very good. She eats a couple shots to close the distance, but once she does get close to you, she can get you down. And that heavy top pressure, brutal top pressure from her when she's on top, like she's either gonna find the finish on you, or you're not gonna get up, right? But yeah, Jasmin just got hit with some clean shots, and Manon, and she got dropped. Fight was over. Manon, she has some heavy hands, crisp striking, and pairing that up with Jasmin's low striking defense, it was just a recipe for disaster. Do I think Jasmin can get the takedowns on Karine Silva? I do think so. I feel like Karine Silva is supposed to be on a 3-fight losing streak right now. It says she won 2 fights ago. But in that fight versus Dion Barbosa was taking her down, winning the striking exchanges, and the judges gave the fight to Karine Silva for throwing elbows from the bottom instead of favoring the ground and pound from top position of Barbosa. So I do think Jasmin can get the takedowns on Karine Silva. I don't think Karine Silva's striking is so good to the point where Jasmin can't eat a couple of shots of hers to close the distance. And Karine Silva doesn't have the best takedown defense, so I see her getting taken down, and if Karine tries to take Jasmin down, she'll just get out physical and be unsuccessful. You know, Jasmin is huge with a big frame. So Jasmin's striking, I feel like it should be good enough to bulldoze through the range of Karine, close the distance. Use her superior frame to work in some takedowns. And Jasmin is good enough to on the ground to avoid any submission attempts from Karine Silva when she does get her down on the ground. So I like the pressure, the grappling pressure of Jasmin. She has elite top control. Whereas, Silva, she can be dangerous from bottom, but she has questionable takedown defense. So I'm gonna say that Jasmin just rinses and repeats the takedowns and just gets to control. Moving on to our next fight, we got Mandel Nallo versus Herbert. I don't think I ever picked a fight and then changed my mind like more than this fight. I switched so many times. I'm just gonna go with Mandel Nallo. I literally changed my picks right before this video. I'm taking Mandel Nallo, but for the longest time I was picking Herbert. I think Herbert is a good fighter. He dropped Ilia Topuria for whatever that's worth, and he obviously holds a ton of UFC experience than this newcomer Mandel. So Jai has the experience, and Jai's only been losing to some high caliber fighters, but Jai hasn't beaten anyone good, and that's ultimately why I changed my pick. Yes, he's losing to decent fighters, but at the end of the day, there isn't real notable wins there. Hopefully I don't regret this pick flip. I'll pick Mandel, but Mandel's 36 years old. He's a prospect, making his debut. Hasn't performed in ways to make me think that he can beat someone who's UFC level caliber fighter. But Jai is a lower tier UFC caliber fighter. When I saw Mandel's last fight on the Contender Series, he won by knockout. But I thought it was a weird knockout. It looked like the punch barely had any pop behind it, but it still managed to knock out his opponent. Like, the guy that Mandel knocked out clearly has no chin. But then I watched some more of his fights and realized he does have some pop in his shots, and he can land some stiff jabs, And also, one thing that I'm thinking about is Jai feels like he arguably beat Padilla in his last fight, in his most recent fight, which took place in Herbert's hometown. Jai, he felt like he got robbed a win in his home country, and now he can get revenge. He can take revenge by getting a win over someone in their home country in Canada, because Mandel is Canadian, So I do think Jai, obviously, he has the more experience against better guys in the UFC. He and Mandel are both considered old for fighting, and Jai has been in the UFC and Mandel hasn't. So I don't see any significant growth from either of them. And if that's the case, I feel like I can take the guy who's has potential. There's no room for growth for Jai. We've seen his best at the UFC level and it's not good enough. I'm going to take a chance on the guy who can still prove that he has the abilities to be good in the UFC, whereas Jai had many chances to show that already and he didn't come through, right? So Jai's gonna fight long. He's gonna have a nice jab here, fight from a distance, try to pick him apart. But Mandel, he has the height and reach as well in this fight, and on top of that, I like that he has power to drop anyone with the right shot. He likes to close the distance and use power. And I'm not super convinced that he can do that to someone like Herbert. Jai can manage distance and be technical from the outside, put up a high volume as well. And Jai also has great 3-round cardio, but I'm going to take a chance on Mandel. I think we'll see Herbert try to establish his rhythm, and fight to his own pace. But I think Mandel has a chance to close the distance, disrupt that rhythm, and land a knockout shot, or at least a shot to wobble Jai, and then start building momentum in the fight, But I truly think this fight, the odds should be a lot closer, because I'm leaning with Mandel because he has the power and he has potential, and it's an unknown ceiling. Whereas Herbert, he has the UFC experience, but it's been inconsistent, right? So I'm gonna say that Mandel, he has the knockout threat, and it's kind of like an upside play. I feel like he should be the underdog here, but I'm not sure. I'm gonna pick Mandel. Moving on to Kyler Phillips versus Charles Jourdain. I'm picking Charles Jourdain. Charles Jourdain has, he's been really outspoken recently on his social media, making memes, seems very confident in himself, and I guess he should be, coming off of a crazy victory win over Davy Grant, where he hit a flying knee, then turns it into a submission victory. Really impressive stuff, and to do that to Davy Grant, it's quite impressive. Davy Grant is no walk in the park. So Jourdain is coming off of 2 submission victories. So he's looking good. But overall, when you take a look in his career, it's kind of up and down for the most part. He'll win some, he'll lose some. He's never won 3 fights in a row in the UFC, so this would be the first time if he does if he does win here. I feel like he can pull it off though against Kyler Phillips. I don't think Kyler Phillips is really a high caliber fighter as of what we've seen lately from him. Like 2 fights ago, he looked good in round one. In his fight with Rob Font, he secured a takedown and maintained top control. But then in rounds 2 and 3, he was completely gassed, got picked apart the whole fight. Then most recently, losing to Vinicius Oliveira, just got bullied by Vinicius Oliveira. And I picked Oliveira to win that fight. And I'm pretty sure he was underdog of the week that fight. Because I really don't like how Kyler Phillips reacts to adversity in the octagon. Like, it's like as soon as he starts meeting resistance, he slows down and he's quick to give up. Like, it's easy for him to get broken down. It seems like there's no dog in him, there's no fight in him. Just recent signs have been showing up, and I feel like those signs make me not be able to trust him, to stick to a game plan or go through the fire to win a fight. Um, Charles Jourdain, he seems like he has that dog in him. He's willing to go through an ugly fight if he has to secure a win. Kyler, he might look good in the beginning of the fight, using some fluid movement, not getting hit. But I think eventually Jourdain will find those shots to land on Kyler Phillips. I feel like Phillips, he breaks too easily. He breaks under pressure and he might gas. Whereas Jourdain, I know he has that dog in him. He's creative and he's dangerous. So I think the pressure from Jourdain is going to be able to break Kyler Phillips. Moving on to our main event of the evening, Mike Malott versus Gilbert Burns. I haven't been surprised by some odds like these in a while. I thought Mike Malott would be the favorite. I'm gonna pick Mike Malott to win this fight. He was like at a minus 600 earlier. Kind of blew my mind, but I'm gonna go with Mike Malott. But Gilbert Burns, he's still one of the biggest savages in the world right now, and just based off of how Gilbert Burns looked in his last fight, I really don't think I can pick him to win a fight here. It looked like he quit, in my opinion. I felt like he could have done more. He could have fought smarter. The fact that Mike Malott is actually a decent fighter who's been looking good, and Gilbert Burns looks like he's completely like washed based off of his last couple fights. Maybe that Jack Della Maddalena fight was one of his better performances, but he hasn't won a fight in the last 4 fights, and I can't pick Burns. Even though there might be something still left in the tank, I just think Malott has a lot more in the tank. And you can say it's because Burns is fighting good competition, but it really is also the fact that he's just not the same fighter anymore. He isn't the same fighter, and he's fighting good guys. Mike Malott looks like he's in the best shape of his life right now, and I can't pick against him. Of course, it's Gilbert Burns. He's always super dangerous, and I've actually been impressed with Mike Malott, and the way he fights. Using good footwork, clean, crisp striking. He had a bit of trouble with Kevin Holland's rangy style, but he won't have that problem here. And before that fight with Kevin Holland, he fought Charles Radke. He was using very nice footwork, crisp striking on Charles Radke. Whereas you take a look at Gilbert's last fight, I feel like he was just throwing haymakers on Michael Morales, hoping something would land. Like, it wasn't a good sight. So it really comes down to the fact that Burns really just hasn't looked good in a long time, and Mike has been looking good. Skill for skill, I got Mike at this point in his career. Even if you take their skills away, their motivational levels, their hunger, the hometown crowd for Malott, it just seems like it's a passing of the torch. And I see Malott, using his high fight IQ, footwork, landing crisp shots, making Burns quit in there. Burns, he still has good grappling. He's still a dangerous counter striker. But I'm favoring the explosive, crisp striking of Malott, his youth and his hunger. I think Malott is going to have to work a lot to keep this fight on the feet, but I do think he can do it. The odds for this fight, they are really crazy. I was expecting Malott to be a minus 200 favorite at most, and to see him in the minus 600 range, it really blew my mind. Like, Gilbert Burns, if he shows up, he can look like a dangerous fight for anyone, but I just feel like it's that last fight that I saw that it probably made like a lot of people get turned off by Burns. He didn't show up, and it wasn't a good sign. I felt like he could have done more, and of course it's easy for me to say that. I'm not in the octagon, but I just feel like he kind of quit in there and he took the easy way out. So someone with hunger and eagerness to win at this stage of his career, I gotta pick that. I gotta pick Mike Malott. You know, he's young, he's sharper, and he's evolving. Whereas Burns, it just looks like he's declining and he looks washed. So I'm gonna say it's Mike Malott. It's a passing of the torch, and it's in his hometown. Mike Malott gets a W. That does conclude this week's picks for UFC Winnipeg. Mike Malott versus Gilbert Burns. Hope you guys enjoyed. Am I right, Miami? And see you guys later.